Today on Know the Truth, Philip de Courcy begins a series about time.
God is never in a hurry, but God is never late. God is precise. God makes everything beautiful in its time. When the circumstances are right and when the moment is right, God will indeed turn the red light to a green light. And I think that's a tremendous encouragement.
Are you feeling stuck in life's traffic jam, itching to speed ahead? Today on Know the Truth, Philip de Courcy explores the dangers of rushing God's plan and the beauty of His perfect timing. Through Joseph's story and examples from history, nature, and the Bible, we're discovering why waiting on God's green light is crucial for our journey. It's a message from a series called It's About Time, and you'll find the full study online at ktt.org. Now, with a message from Genesis 41 called Perfect Timing, here's Philip de Courcy.
In his book, Turning Mountains into Molehills, and in a chapter entitled Avoiding the Accidents of Life, Warren Wiersbe says this: "The National Safety Council is greatly concerned about the slaughter on the highways. Each year, thousands of people are killed and millions more are maimed or injured because of auto accidents. You'll be interested to know that the studies have revealed two basic causes of these serious accidents. One, excessive speed, and two, failure to yield the right of way." Wiersbe says this in response: "When I read that news item, I thought to myself, those are the very causes of the human collisions and tragedies of life. People exceed the spiritual speed limit and rush ahead of God's will, or else they fail to yield the right of way to God." How true. In fact, in Psalm 32 and verse 9, what are we told? "Be not like the horse or the mule." Some people are like a horse. They tend to jump ahead of God's will and purpose. Others are stubborn, not yielding to God's good purposes for them. And surely Wiersbe's on to something here, reminding us that you and I will face some trouble in life and tragedy in life if we seek to exceed the spiritual speed limit, or if we fail to yield right of way to God's good purposes in our lives. I think we'd all agree that exceeding the spiritual speed limit is a constant desire and a constant danger. When you and I get caught up in the slow-moving traffic of life, we're tempted to dart past God's will for the present moment. Was this not a challenge and a temptation to Abraham when God had promised him a son? And yet there is Abraham and his wife Sarah in the twilight of their life, when she's past childbearing age and the promise has not yet been fulfilled. So rather than wait anymore, what does Abraham do? He exceeds the spiritual speed limit. He fails to yield right away to God's sovereign purposes in his life, and he takes to himself another wife, Hagar, and she bears a son, Ishmael, which brought trouble to the house of Abraham. And Ishmael's descendants are a trouble to the seed of Abraham. You and I need to learn the paramount importance of waiting upon God. We need to learn to trust in the perfect timing of the one who transcends time. That's the lesson we want to garner and gather from the story of Joseph. God's perfect timing in time. One of the lessons we need to learn is that we can't exceed the spiritual speed limit. We can only do what God gives us permission to do. James 4 reminds us that we might plan, we might press, but it's only if the Lord wills we will do this and we will do that. And I don't know if you've ever noticed the unbending law of the road, and that is you cannot get to your destination any faster than the traffic lights will allow you. I don't know if your experience has been my experience. You're sitting at a set of traffic lights, you're in a little bit of a hurry, and as they change the green, you morph into Jeff Gordon, and you leave everybody in the dust at the traffic lights, especially Miss Daisy, who's sitting beside you in her town car. And you belt down the road, only to find about a half mile down, the lights have turned red. You're sitting there waiting for everybody to catch up with you, and Miss Daisy arrives with a real Cheshire cat smile on her face. And you learn the lesson that you can't get further or faster than the traffic lights will allow you. And it's the same in life. You and I will only get to where we need to be when we need to be there as God wills it and as His providence allows it. I don't know about you, but I suffer from a spiritual lead foot. And I think you do too. And waiting upon God is not an easy thing to do. But you and I need to realize that speed doesn't necessarily equate to distance. And we need to trust God's perfect timing. In fact, on another occasion, Wiersbe says this: when God is at work, He works with calmness and precision, not with haste and carelessness. And if that is ever exemplified, it's exemplified in this part of the story of Joseph. Joseph will help us see the brake as well as the accelerator is just as much a part of God's purposes and plans for our lives. The stops, as much as the steps of a good man, are ordered by the Lord. So let's learn to wait more patiently and more calmly. Let's adjust our watches to the truth that God is always on time. Let's synchronize our lives to heaven's clock. Because I'm sure you find yourself in life's traffic jam. And you're getting antsy and agitated, and you want the things to move a little quicker than they're doing. And you're about to dive and dart in and out of the lanes of God's good purposes for you. And that's going to cause an accident. Now, there's three things we're going to see. One is, you see, first of all, the time of His release, the testimony at His release, and the throne on His release. The time, the testimony, and the throne. Let's look at, first of all, the time of His release. We're told in chapter 41 and verse 1 that after the butler had been released and had duly forgotten Joseph, that it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. No one could interpret it. The penny drops, and the butler remembers his fault. He remembers that he had let Joseph down. He had shown kindness to the butler, but the butler has shown no kindness to him. This is where we're at in the story. We're told of the time of Joseph's release. It's 2 years after the butler's seeming forgetfulness and God's seeming idleness that Joseph is released. We want to think about that for a moment. In fact, literally, the Hebrew is 2 years of days. This time didn't go by fast. Just there was 1 hour upon another hour, and 1 day upon another day, and 1 month upon another month. 17,520 more hours of waiting on top of the 11 years that are already gone by. 730 more days, 104 more weeks, 24 more months. Let me help you get the math. If you go back to Genesis 37, verse 2, you're going to realize that Joseph is sold into slavery when he's 17. We just read in Genesis 41 and verse 46 that he was 30 when he was released. So between his being sold into slavery and his being exalted to a place of prominence in Egypt, 13 years. We're told here that 2 years back, the butler had been released and forgotten Joseph. So he had been waiting 11 years. That's long enough for the promise of God to be fulfilled, for the dream to materialize, but it's about to materialize. What do we read that Pharaoh says of those who come before Joseph? Bow the knee. The promise is about to be fulfilled. After 11 years and 2 more years, it will be fulfilled. Joseph had to learn to wait. But the time of his release is interesting. 2 years earlier, I think Joseph would have thought to himself, you know what, maybe things are looking up. You know, he hangs his hope on the butler perhaps being kind to him as he was kind to the butler, and putting in a good word in Pharaoh's ear. Days went by and months went by. And maybe in those early days and early weeks and early months, Joseph thought to himself, you know what? You know, it's government bureaucracy. There's a lot of red tape to cut through. Or you know what? Maybe Pharaoh is out on an international mission and the butler hasn't yet had any time to really deal with him. Or even if he's home, the butler's waiting for that choice moment, the best time to bring Joseph's case to Pharaoh's attention. But as days went by and weeks went by and months went by, that hope began to fizzle. And it was 2 more full years. The Hebrew is 2 years of days. But after 2 full years, the gears of God's plan began to mesh, and the events began to move forward at quite a clip. Before he knew it, Joseph stood amidst a thronged, breathless court, surrounded by the evil eyes of the magicians before Pharaoh himself. God had opened a door, and God had released him at a most propitious time. In fact, I want to just draw 2 thoughts as we look at the time of his release. As we look at the timing of it, it was slow in coming, and it was sudden in happening. And I think you and I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about that as we find ourselves standing in the line waiting for something to happen. Or we find ourselves, you know, in the traffic jams of life. It was slow in coming. Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years. 2 years on top of 11 years. 13 years between the dream being given and the fulfillment of that dream being granted. 13 years is a long time, isn't it? To wait for something. It was slow in coming. And Joseph had to learn patience. He wasn't the first child of God to have to learn that. It was a while after David was anointed by Samuel that he actually became king. Anna and Simeon had to wait a whole lifetime to see with their eyes the salvation of the Lord in the coming of the promised Messiah in the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. There's a long line of saints who've had to wait on God's good purposes ripening in their lives. It was slow in coming, but when it came and when the release happened, it happened perfectly. The time was just right. In fact, if you think about that, say the butler had have done his due diligence and had been able to unlock the prison door and get Joseph out. The injustice would have been recognized and the wrong would have been righted 2 years early. What do you think would have happened? I think Joseph would have scampered home. But that's not what God had planned. That's not what God had purposed. And here's what you want to think about. 2 years earlier would have been too early. 2 years earlier, too early. It was at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. And that triggered the chain reaction of events that would lead to Joseph's elevation to power and the fulfillment ultimately of the dream of his brothers and his family coming to bow down before him. And in this time, God is acting as a production manager. All right? Joseph had been given the script. He knew his lines, but the stage hadn't been set. The cue hadn't been given. God was acting as a production manager. And although the time of release is slow in coming, when it comes at the right time, the ripe time. And you and I want to nail that down. God makes everything beautiful in its time. There's a time for everything. And God has his finger on everything. When the circumstances are ripe and when the moment is right, God will indeed turn the red light to a green light. And I think that's a tremendous encouragement. God is never in a hurry, but God is never late. God is precise. Have you ever thought about the punctuality of God? That's a challenge for people that come late to church. They're coming to worship a God who is actually punctual himself. I came across this in an interesting sermon. I love to quarry old books. And I have a book in my library written by a Scottish apostolic pastor by the name of Ian McPherson. And in this book, there's a compilation of sermons. One is entitled The Punctuality of God. It's an intriguing sermon. And here's what he says. It is the supreme paradox of history that the eternal God is always in time. He who stands beyond the ordered sequence of temporal events pays the strictest attention to the march of the moments and plans his interventions in terrestrial affairs, or what look to us like interventions. For God is within his world as well as above it, immanent as well as transcendent, with the greatest possible care and precision. Is that not one of the great paradoxes? The eternal God is always on time. The timeless one is always timely. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, on top of 11 years, but all precisely planned by a God who acts precisely and punctually. In fact, Ian McPherson bases his thought on a number of texts. What do you read in Romans 5, verse 6? In due time, Christ died for the ungodly. You read in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, that when the day of Pentecost was what? Fully come, the Spirit of God comes. Just exactly at that right moment. During that season of Pentecost, which was so appropriate for the descent and coming of the Spirit of God himself. But one of the best verses is the other verse he uses in Galatians 4, verse 4. What do we read? In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman under the law, that he might redeem us from out under the curse of the law. In the fullness of time. Really, when the time was ripe, when the time was right, God sent his Son. Now, let me paint a little bit of the background. See, when Jesus came, he came at a most propitious time. What do we call the years between the end of Malachi and the beginning of Matthew? We call those the 400 silent years, because prophecy had ceased. God wasn't given any more revelation. Those were silent years. But don't think that God was sitting still, although he was indeed sitting silent. God was very active, and if you paint in the background, it was during those years you have the Jewish dispersion. When many Jews went to some of the great commercial centers of the ancient world, and they established synagogues and they practiced their faith amidst paganism. And we know that when Jesus Christ comes and the great work of redemption is complete at the fullness of time, at the end of the age, according to Hebrews, he comes and makes himself a sacrifice for sin. He then says to his disciples, what? Go into all the world and preach this gospel. And one of the first ports of call for an apostolic evangelist was what? The synagogues in the great major cities. They became springboards and fishing pools for the early church. I'll tell you a second element. During that time, you have the spread of the universality of the Greek language, which made it easy for the heralders of the gospel to go to different places and different cultures, but speak a common language. They were able to travel, because during the time of the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana was implemented. There was greater lines of communication. The shipping lanes were open. There were roads that were built. It wasn't all bad under the Roman Empire. There was a lot of good things happened in terms of commerce and communication. And those roads and the order of the Roman Empire provided a certain protection and a certain accessibility for those early evangelists. Plus, during that time, you have the evident decay of the pagan religions, which created a spiritual vacuum. And we find Paul stepping into that vacuum in Acts chapter 17 and say, can I tell you about the God you haven't yet discovered, the one you call the unknown God? He'll fill the emptiness. When the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son. The eternal God is always on time. And you and I need to grasp that reality. In fact, that's so much so we don't even need to, we can look at Scripture, we can look at creation. God's providence is like God's nature. Among the stars, there are no haphazard moments. I mean, every so often we're told on the evening news what? If you go out tomorrow at 5 o'clock, or whatever the time is that they'll say, you'll be able to see what? An eclipse. How do they calculate that? Because the God who ordered nature is a God of precision. We not only see it in history, we see it in creation. Men calculate transits, eclipses, conjunctions 1,000 years ahead and know to the smallest fraction of a second that the calculations will be verified. The sun never rises late. We're told, aren't we, the night before, here's the time you'll have sunrise. What the time for sunset? God's clock is never a second slow. You see it in the Bible, you see it in nature. We could go on illustrating it even from church history. A few years ago, I had the privilege of preaching in Germany. And in one day, we went to Wittenberg and actually stood where we believe that Luther stood and declared his protestation against the Catholic Church and its doctrine. Given no opportunity to debate, Luther said, well, then, if you give me no option, here I stand. My conscience bears witness, and I'm held captive by the word of God. And that launched the Protestant Reformation, which changed the face of Europe. But in the one day I left Wittenberg, and I can't remember, it was an hour and a half or something in a car. We headed to a town called Gothenburg. And around the time Luther was doing this, printing was coming to prominence. You think that was a coincidence? No, I think it was a providence that when these men wanted to write and show the excesses and errors of the church of their day, they could put it into pamphlets that was printed and given out in the thousands. Again, around that time, you're going to have, Tyndale putting God's word into the language of the people. It gets out. That's a coincidence, isn't it? No, that's a providence. God's timing is something that you and I need to get our heads around and our hearts around. It was slow in coming, but when it came precisely.
That's Philip de Courcy reminding us that God's timing is perfect timing. You're listening to Know the Truth, and Pastor Philip will be back in just a moment. If you missed part 1 or any part of today's message titled Perfect Timing, feel free to catch up online at ktt.org. Or for easy listening on the go, download the KTT app or podcast. Just search for Know the Truth with Philip de Courcy, and then look for the series called It's About Time. Philip?
Hey, I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being a part of the Know the Truth family. Some of you may have been following our ministry for quite some time, and while you're familiar with me and what we do here, I'd love the opportunity to get to know you better. Whether you're a long-term listener who's never reached out to us before, or someone who used to be connected to us but has since lost touch, or even if you're a frequent supporter looking to deepen your involvement, I'd love to welcome you on board as a Truth Ambassador. Our Truth Ambassadors are faithful monthly givers who genuinely and generously support our gospel work and receive exclusive resources and communications directly from me. If you're interested in joining us or going deeper, you can learn more and sign up by calling 888-644-8811 or by visiting us online at ktt.org. We'd be thrilled to have you on our team.
We are, absolutely. And as our way of saying thank you, we'll send you a copy of Investor Disappointments Going for Growth by Paul Mollard, as well as a welcome package and exclusive weekly messages from Pastor Philip. So again, call 888-644-8811 or give online at ktt.org. I'm Wayne Shepherd. Come back tomorrow when Pastor Philip continues a lesson on the power of divine timing. Learn why syncing your life with heaven's clock can lead to unexpected blessings and avoid spiritual collisions. That's Wednesday on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."